What's going on, everybody? Thank you so much for tuning into the third episode of Inside the Tide podcast, the show that's designed to explore unconventional parenting concepts and tools for holistic self improvement. I'm your host, Tyler. I'm a nature based pediatric occupational therapist, a father, and also a husband. I have on the show today Emily Bryce. She's a new mom who is a fellow nature based pediatric occupational therapist. And she runs a forest kindergarten and has an outdoor OT practice outside of Seattle. We talk about how there's so many dire issues facing kids of today and how nature can provide solutions to many of these issues that they are facing, and also how the everyday parent can simply incorporate many of the strategies that Emily and I utilize in our profession into their child's lives. So be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review if you enjoy this episode. And let's get into it. All right. Welcome, Emily. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on today. I appreciate it.
Of course.
So I cannot wait to get into some of the details about what you do and can't wait to hear from you what you do. But can you share with the listeners also what you do and who you are and just kind of give a brief overview of that? Because I know we'll probably go quite a bit down the rabbit hole once you get started with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Emily Bryce. I'm an occupational therapist in Western Washington. I practice across the Sound in Indianola. So it's across town from Seattle, in a little rural community. And I got my master's in OT in Southern California, which I grew up in California. I did my undergrad in psychology, anthropology, and human development. I was just always interested in people and why people do things. And shortly after, I moved to Hollywood to try to do Hollywood and be a actress and producer and stuff. And during that time, I needed a job that was really flexible, and so I started working for this company that does like baby classes, mommy and me sort of classes, a lot of times with celebrities because that's who lives in LA, and production, giants and directors and stuff. And so I started working in that, and we put babies in spaghetti and we learned about the sensory system and we did audio tracking and visual tracking and sort of early intervention-y sort of stuff with 8-week-old infants and up with their parents and caregivers, nannies a lot of the times. And I was at a wedding once and someone was like, "Oh, you also put babies in spaghetti? So does this other girl." And I was like, "What? I have a very unique job. Like, there's no way that she in Ohio also does what I do." And I was like, "Well, so, what's your deal?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm a pediatric OT." And I was like, "Wait a minute. There's a legitimate career that does kind of what I do right now, but is a real job." And, so that night I looked online. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I only have to take 2 lab sciences. I could get into the master's program. Amazing." So, I did that and got into master's program for OT at Stanford University in Irvine area in California, and did that. And had been really interested in forest kindergartens and thought those were separate things. Just I love forest kindergarten. I love the idea of kids being outside and being in nature. It's something that I was like, "Oh, I should get trained in that. This would be really cool." I had read The Cedar Song Way and just started looking up all the different trainings and stuff in California and up and down the West Coast. And The Cedar Song Way was in Washington. I was like, "Oh, maybe someday I can go up there and take this training. It sounds really awesome. I want my kid to be a part of that," and et cetera, et cetera. And then I went to a conference and it was an OT that was doing nature-based OT. And I was like, "Wait a minute, I can mush these things together? I can see kids outside in this kind of the same sort of reasoning between both. Like the reason that you do school outside is kind of like the reason you would do OT outside." And so that became a dream of mine. And in California, it was way too expensive. We didn't want to live there forever. Neither my husband and I were from that area in Southern California. And so we lived up and down the West Coast. And I found a job for a school based OT in Bremerton, Washington, and worked there for my first couple of years, getting my feet wet as an OT, and found our perfect land. We have 5.5 acres up here and a creek, and it's awesome. And that was right about when the pandemic started. And so instead of being like, "Oh, I'll just start my own business when I had the chance, it was like, "Oh, I need to start seeing kids outside now. Like, this is the time to do this." And then we started developing this space. We bought our land and started getting ready to build our house here. And we built this awesome sensory playground in our forest. And so I started seeing kids here. And then my business, my forest kindergarten, started a couple years ago. So I was able to have more kids here during the day rather than just after school hours, and started being able to support kids for longer time. So for 3, 4 hours as opposed to just a 1 hour OT session. And just saw amazing growth just so fast with these kids that I had been seeing in OT myself outside, same person, same location for the last like year. And I had more growth than my first like 2 weeks of school because there were other peers and I had them for a longer time. So the first 2 weeks, we like met all their goals. And it was really exciting and kind of like, oh gosh, why am I doing anything else? Like, I should be seeing kids in this kind of model all the time. And so it's just increased. We do awesome summer camps. My business sort of supports the work that Center for Therapeutic Intervention does, so I can still support kids with insurance without having to take insurance myself. But 90% of it's outside. We do have some small indoor spaces so that the kids that are really impacted by the elements, by cold, by wet, have a place to be in the winter because it's very wet and cold here in the winter months of Washington. So we have places that they can work on their other goals rather than just being, cold and wet and working on that. But 90% of the year, everybody is outside. And it's just been amazing and my business tries to help other OTs as I take a lot of student OTs and it's an emerging practice area, nature based OT. And so I like to take a lot of students. And so that's what I've been up to. And then I had recently had a baby. That's been changing my whole worldview of how everything works and looking at development and from the very beginning. And it's been a really cool, you know, other part of a lens to add on to my sort of sensory integrative and developmental lens that I've been using already. Yeah. That's mostly
Yeah.
what we've been up to.
Definitely provides a whole different perspective when you have your own kid to be able to integrate all that. And yeah, I think it's funny too because just the world of occupational therapy is so small. So we got hooked up obviously because we're both sharing such a common interest in nature-based occupational therapy. And when I first came across what you were doing, I was just so inspired by all of the things that you have going on. It's so cool what you're able to offer, how creative you get with everything, and I'm excited as this episode progresses too, just to kind of get more into those details and obviously the benefits too. But yeah, what you're doing is amazing. I love it. Just want to give you kudos for that because super
Thanks.
inspirational, not only to me, but I know so many other people too. So keep doing what you're doing. So you talked a little bit about the services you offer, the forest kindergarten, and then I know you offer nature-based occupational therapy sessions after that as well. If you could touch a little bit on like the specifics of the positive impacts that you've seen that nature has had on children, I guess both in the forest kindergarten side of things, and if you could explain a little bit more about what that is, and then also with the children that might need a little bit more attention in the occupational therapy sessions, just
Yeah.
what benefits you're seeing with them being
Yeah,
in nature.
absolutely. Outdoors really allows the therapist to have like a co-therapist. So you're able to keep the entire rapport with the child um, without challenging them and then ruining your rapport. So, as an example, when I was in a traditional indoor clinic, if I wanted to challenge a kid with tactile defensiveness and have them that just right challenge, I'm the one that has to set forward the challenge. So I would maybe put something that they wanted to play with and in shaving cream, and we would do like a car wash with their truck that they like. And, I would make it so it's never stressful and always something that they felt was fun and rewarding. But I'm still the one that put the shaving cream there. And the kid kinda knows that, even if they don't tell you that they know that, like, that damages your therapeutic relationship just a little bit. And not in a huge way, especially if you're doing it very play-based, very child-led, in the same way I would be doing it outside. Well, but outside, I don't have to worry about that at all. I am there, it's us against nature. And Laura Park Figueroa talks a lot about this, and she did her doctorate research in it. So if you're interested in more of how that, she's some cool modeling that's coming out hopefully soon. But it's pretty much, and that's what I've been feeling the whole time is out here is like it's us against nature in the way that if they were on a little walk and they want to go, we're making potions and they want to go get some water from the creek. We go to get the creek, but they trip and they fall in the mud and now their hands are muddy. I didn't have anything to do with that other than I'm here to support and co-regulate with you. Like, I didn't create the situation where they had to put their hands in mud for us to have a therapy session. Nature just has mud. And so what can we do about it? Like, then we can process and problem solve in the moment. I can co-regulate with them and be like, yes, it's hard, it's cold, or that was upsetting, that was, surprising, whenever it is, then we can work through it. So then next time, either they're more careful with their stepping, so they're trying to prevent the action, or they're less stressed out when it happens because it's bound to happen again. And like on my property, I leave all of the ferns sort of in the trail because it gives me a really good understanding of where their sensory system is at, tactile wise, especially. Because in the beginning, some of mine were sensitive little kids, even kids I don't have for OT, like just for school kids that don't also see me for OT. I guess it give me an idea of where they're at because I have a lot of 2-year-olds, so their system's still growing. And sometimes they will just like, I cannot walk through there. There are things in the way, or they'll like walk backwards, or they'll cry, or they'll like flail their hands around, or they won't walk through until you move the ferns, etc. And then, after a little bit, they're like just running through the ferns and not having any, reaction to how it's affecting them. And that's something that shouldn't be affecting them. Like, yeah, it might tickle a little if you were to stand there and really think about it, but it's not something that should be distressing. And so if it is distressing, then it's easy for you to see it rather than I created the thing where I tickled them with a feather to see if they are distressed. I just let them walk the creek on our tour and I can get a good idea of how their tactile system is doing, especially for light touch, which can be very distressing and get in the way of a lot of things like dressing. Um, so even just when we're giving our tours, it's an easy way to kind of gauge some of that by just using nature as what nature is. Nature is incredibly sensory rich. And so having that, varied sensory experiences every day that is both really, really vast, but also sort of muted. So unlike when you're inside, everything is kind of turned up. So the lights are always brighter and there's often lots of color. So visually, it can be really overwhelming or exciting, but it's just a very high level of visual input. You have to be very like intentional to keep it down, especially in a kids related space. Like every preschool, just like the exploding rainbow, which for some kids is amazing and some kids is incredibly overwhelming. And then same with auditory. While there's so many sounds, like such a rich soundscape in nature, it's all sort of calmer and muted. And so there are bird sounds and there's like thousands of layers of sound and there's things that are really far away and things that are close up. And that's indoors, that's just not how it works. You might have variety of sounds like the hum of a refrigerator, and I'm not discounting any of these sounds. It's not like, oh, natural sounds are better than man-made sounds. That's not what this is about. It's in the square walls, our voice bounces differently. So our voice always comes back in a similar like wavelength, so a similar volume, really. And you can feel it when you're walking in nature if you walk against somewhere like I have a shed. And so if we're walking and talking and I'm kind of facing the shed talking during like a tour and we walk by the shed, I can feel my voice bounce back and hit my ears. Because when you're in nature, your voice just sort of goes into the forest or goes into the park or goes into the ocean or wherever you are. And so it doesn't just bounce back and hit you. And so for kids that are really sensitive, that allows them to have a really sound rich environment that isn't stressful, that isn't overstimulating. So then you can work through if there's a very sudden noise that's close by, which is what our brains are primed to be like nervous about, because that could mean there was a predator in the bushes. Just thinking about, why we have these feelings about sounds. But when everything is close in, your brain is always feeling there's a predator in the bushes, like at all times. And so there's never this time to like relax. Same with our eyes are kind of always on high alert and working really hard when we're inside because everything is bright and everything is close. So yeah, it just allows like a lot more variance in those two systems. And then obviously tactile can't really be outside for tactile. I think almost everybody, even non OTs, kind of understand that. It's like that's usually time when they say like outdoors is great for sensory. They're often talking about tactile because you have every type of touch situation out there, and there's cold, and there's hot, and pretty much anything you can discover except maybe vibration. Just bring in vibration. It's really uncommon in nature. But everything else, temperature and light touch, deep touch, all different types of textures to deal with and practice with. And then obviously kids move more outside. So the vestibular component is amazing. And the proprioceptive component, you're more likely to climb outdoors than indoors. And there's a variety of textures while you're doing it. You climb inside in a really great, awesome sensory gym, unless they've tried really hard because they're thinking about it, most everything's sort of smooth. And so while you have a really good opportunity for climbing, like your proprioceptive sensory input is great, you're not also getting tactile input during that time. Whereas outside, if you're climbing something, nothing's really that smooth. So you're also getting the feedback from the tactile system from the bumpy log that you're climbing on, or the way that the bark feels, or that you reach up and the moss is squishy, or whatever it is. So just sort of that multi-sensory system is where our bodies were supposed to be. And so it's very easy to grow our sensory system there, which is sort of the baseline of being able to work on a lot of things. And then that's sort of that problem solving and being able to have like a co-therapist and everything changes. So being able to deal with, every day you go into an indoor sensory clinic is the same unless you do it on purpose to change it, which is great. And all these awesome indoor therapists do that. They try to make it different so that you have the ability to practice different things. Nature just does it for you. Like you go out and there's a new log across the way, and well, how do we get across the path now? There's like a tree fell down. Or, everything, it blew all these things in a different place than we had before. Or an animal came through and moved the pumpkin we were carving, or whatever it is. So, and then the cleanup's less. Even if you do a crazy, messy situation, you usually can just move to a different spot or like hose it down, as opposed to having to clean up the whole clinic. Doing beans and lentils outside is so much easier than trying to do it inside. Even if you're just doing the same type of activity, even shaving cream, so much easier to clean up outside than it is inside. So that's a lot of things I really love about doing OT outside. And honestly, my forest kindergarten is really similar because I'm an OT. So I kind of just OT wherever I am with whatever people I have. But forest kindergarten is really just like a child led, inquiry based. So you're not just telling them answers. Um, we're more facilitating as adults as opposed to leading and providing activities, and it's a place for them to experience nature in how their bodies want to do it, and we just help facilitate, which is really similar to how you do OT. And so it really kind of mushed really nicely together. So when I learned like the Cedar Song way, which is how I'm trained in forest kindergarten, it felt so much like sensory integration, but just through a different lens, like an educational lens, as opposed to like the occupational therapy lens. And a lot of it was talked about in similar language. And I really just that they just jive so nicely together. So now I kind of do both everywhere. So the
Yeah,
biggest difference, I guess, is just there's more kids usually in forest kindergarten than there are in a traditional OT session, which I feel like the peers really help a lot with the just right challenge.
definitely. Yeah. And when I first came across forest kindergartens, it was something that I was unfamiliar with, even being in the field of occupational therapy. And just like a little background on that too. So forest kindergarten started in Germany, I believe in the early 1800s. And the guy's name was Frederick Frobel, if you want to look him up, for listeners that are interested. But he felt that children should be learning outdoors strictly, and no formal textbook learning should be taking place before the age of 6 or 7, which I found pretty fascinating because, in our society where we really, really push the academic learning, this forest kindergarten kind of thought was that get kids outdoors and then they'll be able to get more complex formal learning later. And our country is quite a bit different with how we view that. So that was something that like immediately caught my interest and I vibed with. And then just to also think like how different it is in being outdoors. And you mentioned, all of the sensory benefits, but just like to really, really think of not only on the physical and the sensory side of how amazing it is, and the fact that you don't need to do that setup for things and it provides it for you. That's just amazing in itself. But then kids also get outdoors and they're developing that empathy towards nature, and they're able to, like, you just see less aggression and you just see that kids are calmer, and to see that a setting could do that is amazing. And I know obviously as adults too, and probably most people listening, we see how much that changes our internal state being outside. So it makes sense. And to think that, it was over 200 years ago where these ideals came about. And it is so interesting to see it kind of taking hold. And I know it's not really popular now. I mean, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, you might, Google it and find the occasional news story about like, oh, this preschool strictly outside. And it's everybody's like, what? But it's been around for such a long time, and it's a pretty basic concept and it makes sense. And I think that's the other thing too, like the simplicity of it. We've kind of as a society become so much more just complicated. And
Yeah.
it is so simple, we get kids outside, they learn differently, they take things in significantly differently, and then we see the output that's put out from them as well, just significantly different and it's crazy. And I know you mentioned too just how you saw some different behaviors from kids as well, and I absolutely have myself too. Like I would see kids in the clinic, and then I would see that those same kids outdoors. And there was one kid I remember in particular. We saw him in the clinic. He was extremely aggressive. He ran in circles, pushed every kid that he came up to. You couldn't even really stop him for a second and just get his attention for a half a second, really. And he came to one of our outdoor events. It was one of the scavenger hunt hikes that we had. And I honestly could have been convinced that somebody different. He had a twin that was just the opposite level of functioning from how he was, and he came out there, was leading the group, was so excited about everything, was so friendly with all the other kids, and just to see a setting change, what that does, like how simple that change is, it makes you think, how isn't everybody doing this?
Yeah. Well, and also even as you mentioned, like for the adults, like I give talks sometimes about how to avoid burnout as OTs. I was like, just go outside, no matter what setting you're in. Like you work in the mental health setting, you work in a geriatric setting, like find ways of just going outside. You're doing home health, like just try to do dressing outside. Try to work on their grooming, but like on the porch. It's good for your mental health and for their mental health. And we have lots of studies that show how awesome, being outside is for our mental health. Um, which is a huge component, still in the post-COVID world, like, our kids are still reeling from a lot of this, and they were very stuck inside, and, those kids are now still dealing with that, even though it feels like it was a long time ago, it really wasn't, and in kids' lives, it was really a good chunk of their life, and so having everything that they had and a lot of their therapies and all their schooling and everything was online for a couple years, a lot of places, and, and that, took a toll on them in just how they related to the natural environment as well, because, parks were even like closed for a while, so they weren't able to deal with it in even just in like a home setting. And so, what you talked about a little bit, as sort of developing empathy, the Cedar Song Way has compassion scaffolding, which I really like the word that talks about like loving yourself, loving others, and loving the environment. And some people need to start at different places on that. And a lot of our kids, especially those who have experienced trauma, which we work with a lot with OT, often can't really maybe have a lot of love for themselves or love for others because of stuff that's happened to them, or with mental health stuff, a lot of love for others. I mean, love for self can be really challenging, and love for others maybe feels unsafe. And so, love for the environment is such a wonderful place to start, because once you like start building that love, then you can branch it to the other places. That's the scaffolding part of it. And so, being like, maybe they really wanna get their big feelings out and whack stuff with sticks. Well, let's be like, "Oh, well, like, these ones are baby plants, these ones are alive, like, let's go get this dead branch," or, like, "Let's attack this old stump," or, "Let's dig really hard on the dirt hill." Like, what else can we do that doesn't harm another living thing? We wanna pick berries, but let's leave some also for the birds, and, like, we're making a fairy house. We wanna pick some ferns or whatever, and there's plenty around, and it's not gonna hurt the fern, but let's double check that there's not, like, a bug living on it, or, like, that there's someone spun a cocoon. And so just, like, calling or "Let's move the slug out of the trail before we do our race so we don't worry about stepping on him," and those kind of things are, just such a nice way to, like, bring in these little moments of empathy that allow that, like, love for the environment, and you see it just ripples, especially kids that get it every day, like, in forest kindergarten, and they're just around that sort of language and around that sort of idea. They're the ones that are like, "Oh, mommy, oh, we have to move the bug out of the way, like, let's move it out of the," and that sort of just becomes their ethos, and those are the people that are gonna save the world. They're the ones that are gonna care about the environment and help make sure it's still a priority. And so when kids experience that and experience how joyous and interesting and sort of loving the world is from the environmental standpoint, like those are the ones that go into love and save the world in the environmental standpoint as well. So I
Yeah.
think that's a really important thing that we need to get back to, and not in a antithesis of some of the awesome growth that we've had as a society as far as technology and all that. I mean, this is amazing. Because this technology, we're having this awesome conversation and other people can hear it. And that's not the problem. The problem is we lost a little bit of our love for the world, which we don't want to numb our current generations and our children about, saving this world, because if it all to them lives in the cloud. and lives online, they're gonna lose what they didn't even know they need desperately. A nature
Yeah.
deficit disorder, whatever, Richard Louv, that's already now old news as far as he wrote that book
Yeah.
quite a while ago at this point, but it's the same idea.
Still super relevant today.
Still
And
relevant, yeah.
definitely, yeah, and you touched on it too. I know you mentioned obviously like the pandemic time, how much changed, and the fact that kids weren't able to get outside. But I think to even go further beyond that, like early 2000s, late 1990s, we started to see as a society like significant shift for kids and all facets. I mean, you mentioned the disconnect from each other and nature, and obviously what technology has done in the last 5-10 years, especially. But there's some statistics that I had brought that I thought kind of would more reinforce that point of just how important it is. But from 1991 to 2001, the US Department of Education had some data that showed that the number of 4-year-olds getting either OT, speech, or physical therapy increased 76%. And the number of 5-year-olds in that same 10-year period increased 94%, those that were getting services. And then from 1980 to 2009, the CDC found the number of obese children tripled, which is really concerning. And I think this is honestly a pretty low figure, but there's a recent study that found the average child spends between 6 and 7 hours per day on screens and only 30 minutes a week in unstructured outdoor play. So it obviously coincides just generationally that kids are getting outdoors less often. And I know a lot of it, like you had mentioned the Richard Louv book, and there's also another book called Barefoot and Balanced. I forget the name of.
Bounced and Barefoot by
Yeah,
Angela
yeah.
Hanscom.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah,
But
she's
yeah,
amazing.
it's amazing. She talks about how playgrounds are made injury proof now, which is great. It's awesome to see that kids are getting hurt less, but it's also doing such a disservice to children because they're not having as much of a physical challenge. They're not learning safety awareness the way that they should. They're not falling. Like, you hate to see kids fall, but every child that grew up, 30, 40, 50 years ago knows that you needed your cuts and bruises to really progress. And it is definitely concerning to see the figures that are coming out. And it's also just as optimistic to see forest kindergartens are picking up, nature-based therapies are picking up, and people are starting to finally bat an eye at it and realize how important that it is to actually get kids outdoors. And I really hope that those statistics could start going the other way because it is really important. And yeah, you just really don't like to see that kind of negative growth. And especially in our field where our livelihoods depend on seeing more kids, that's great. But we don't want to see the kids for all of these problems that they're presenting with. And we want to see overall growth. And for people that are for the most part, recently in the field of occupational therapy compared to some of the veterans, like it's kind of normal for us and it shouldn't be. And it shouldn't be normal for new therapists coming in. And the older generation really needs to make that a deal that we need to make widespread change. So we have less people to see because as much as we need to do that to keep our jobs going,
Yeah.
we don't want to see as many.
And we'll find other things to help people with. OT is nice and wonderfully broad like that.
Yeah,
No, it would
absolutely.
be amazing. I mean, I see a lot of kids for anxiety. And that sucks. Like these are 5, 6, 7 year olds. And, I mean, I'm happy they're coming to me for support because there's plenty of the others that don't have any support and don't have somebody to work with. But like, that's a big bummer to have a bunch of kids that have anxiety and it's, partially in the cultural zeitgeist, but also like, it's not just that we're paying attention. And the part of that statistics, especially the OT ones, is that we started to pay attention. We started realizing that kids needed support, so support's increased. I know that is the school districts, especially. They weren't even in the school districts, started pretty much in the 80s for OT. But a lot of it is, I think, just removing all the other support. So it's kids used to have neighborhoods that they could hang out in and felt safe and be outside with their friends after dark and, just run around and bike across neighborhoods. And, like, our parents and grandparents talk about this kind of stuff all the time. And, I'm in my mid 30s for context. And, I grew up in a pretty outdoor area because we were in the middle of nowhere and all we could do was hang out outside, but there weren't any friends around and we couldn't bike to anybody's house. Like it was pretty rural. And so, you know, our sort of it shifted a lot. Our cultural sort of being shifted and we didn't do anything to replace it. And I think while culture is going to shift and the way that houses are built in certain areas and how they do greenways and how we move to cities versus suburbs versus da 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 da, like all the kinds of stuff, we can't control all that. But we need to supplement what we lost. And I think that's something that, like, getting outside, whether as a family or within your therapy that you're already doing, or with your schooling, where you spend a ton of hours of children's lives, huge portion of their life is spent in some type of school. Like, why not also that be outside? Even half outside would be great, you know, to sort of supplement what we've lost in a lot of other ways. So it's just we don't want to lose all that awesomeness that we've gained by then losing all of our strengths and our love for the environment and our a lot of our health. Which with food systems and everything, like all we can really do is go outside. We can't change the entire way we do agriculture in the United States. Honestly, I think a lot of people have tried that and it's pretty challenging. You can have a backyard farm and do your best, but in an overall cultural sense, it is how it's going to be. So what else can you do about it? And that's, go outside.
And I think, the first step is just getting parents educated all over about the benefits and obviously just the examples and the research that shows how beneficial it is, but also really intuitively going within yourself and thinking, where do I operate best? Do I operate best in a cubicle for 8 hours a day, or do I operate 8 hours sitting in a park or on a beach or whatever it might be? So, yeah, just getting that out there and then really translating that experience and that knowledge into advocation on a large scale in society. And I really think that that's going to be the solution. And you had kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier too, just about some of the weather and this and that. But could you talk a bit about some of the challenges or misconceptions that you hear from parents when it comes to nature-based services? I know you offer it in
Yeah.
kind of a variety of different ways. And then also
Hmm.
just some solutions for parents that might be interested in doing this or might be on the fence about nature immersion, but don't really know about some of those things that most parents come to with
Yeah.
their concerns with.
Oh, totally. So in forced kindergarten settings or in, outdoor OT, a lot of it is sort of like, well, but what if it's cold? Or what if it's wet? Or what if it's not ideal weather? Well, it's only not ideal because you've decided it's not ideal. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people that have even stepped their toe in this have heard the phrase, like, there's no such thing as bad weather, only inappropriate clothing, which is, I guess, is based in Sweden or something. We've talked about it so much, I feel like it's been bastardized and probably didn't even really exist as a saying. But anyway, the idea is awesome. And it's really, yes, but that can be really challenging for some families, to having like, oh, well, you just have to have better clothes. Well, clothes are expensive and nice outdoor gear is expensive. And so, like, well, how can we help support that? And what can we do to make sure that's more equitable? Because, well, yeah, it's so great to just go buy some Patagonia for your, 18-month-old that's going to grow out of it in, maybe 10 minutes because that's how fast they grow. Then that's all well and good, but, like, let's set up some situation where we can have lending libraries, and let's set up some situations where this kinda clothes aren't as expensive, and there's some really awesome companies that are trying really hard to make it way more affordable and way more accessible and providing grants and stuff to different schools to be able to provide, scholarships and stuff for this. But, the weather and how we talk about the weather is where we start with that. So even if a kid is not perfectly outfitted to be outside for 8 hours or something, or even 4 hours, that doesn't mean that if it's raining on you guys' walk to the library, that you're not gonna go to the library. So that's really where it needs to start. Yeah, sure, if you're doing a full nature immersion program and it's outside of your financial situation to be able to buy all the perfect gear so your kid is perfectly comfortable, or maybe with a lot of our kids, they can't wear the perfect gear because of sensory stuff. They can't wear extra those little rain suits because they make a swish, swish, swish sound, and that's just absolutely intolerable. But there's still ways that we can talk about so that they're not upset about getting wet, and other ways that we can accommodate those kind of things. And so we sort of need to stay creative, but the language is a big part of it. So instead of being like, "Oh, it's kinda yucky out today," like, "Maybe we'll do it tomorrow," be like, "Oh, like, what could we get? It's raining outside, and we're gonna go to the library, like, what do we need?" And whether that's just like a cheap, poncho or whether that's your full cool tuffo suit or whatever, that doesn't really matter. It's about the attitude about being outside. And a lot of current parents right now, it's about a 50-50 what I found, so, like, the 30-ishes, us millennials, um, is where their comfort in the outdoors lies. So, there we were right on that cusp, as you were talking about, of how much we were either indoor kids or outdoor kids. And prior to us, for the generations before, were all outdoor kids. And the people that have that are parents right now have different levels of being comfortable with the outdoors. And so being able to challenge yourself as a parent and be like, yeah, I could put on a jacket and do this. This is okay. I don't need to push my like, oh, we should stay inside. It's cold. I want to be cozy. I mean, sure, it's nice to be cozy, but like our kid is going to internalize that and then be like, oh, outside is only nice when it's sunny. And that sucks, especially if you live in a large part of the United States where only sunny a tiny piece of the year is perfect weather. And then it might be really hot. And then you don't want to be outside because it's really hot. So being able to like think about how you're talking about weather and how you're talking about comfort versus, you know, it's more neutral. Like it just is raining. It doesn't suck that it's raining. It isn't like going to get in the way of our plans. We're going to do things because it's raining. And, that's a really big shift that's awesome for a lot of people. That's still pretty hard comparatively to like, "Oh, I have to go invest in this whole outdoor equipment so my kid can always be outside." And that's cool. If you have those means and you wanna do that, awesome possum, like, please. But otherwise, just work on how you're talking about the weather because they're internalizing the way that we talk about the weather and how we feel about the weather. So maybe challenge yourself. And normally, if you guys were just going to sit inside and you were going to, read and they were going to play quietly because it was like rest time, like try doing that in your yard. Just like try reading outside and they can play quietly outside. Like try just shifting some of the stuff that you do. Do meal times outside. That's a really fun one. Kids love that. Picnics. Don't we all love picnics? You don't have to set up a whole elaborative picnic. You can literally just take exactly what you're going to get with your plate and like go outside and eat it. Whether that's in like the little courtyard of an apartment building, whether that's in your yard, whether you go to the park down the street, whatever it is. Even if you're like stopping because you're, in a rush and got fast food, eat outside as opposed to inside. Like it doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to be this elaborate, exciting, like picture perfect Montessori moment or whatever. It's just to be able to do the things in nature and they make it so special. The kids really, really enjoy that kind of stuff. And and it allows you to sort of be like, how can I do this but outside? The 1,000 hours outside is a really cool way to challenge yourself, keeping track of how many hours a year you spend outside. It's an organization. That's a nice way to, track that for yourself if that makes you feel like you want to show that you have improvement from the prior year. If you're gonna read a book on your Kindle, if you're gonna play on your iPad, just sit in a hammock outside instead. Like you're still getting a lot of those benefits, even if you're doing something that you would do inside. So that's where I tell families it's like that little step. It's like literally your kid wants to just play video games on their iPad. Just set up a cool hammock or a cool hangout spot on your porch. That still counts. It's still allowed.
Yeah.
And it still gives you the auditory benefits are still there. They're still feeling the air on their skin. All that kind of stuff is still there. And it teaches them that like they can do stuff outside, even if it's like normal stuff that seems like it's indoors. And that's really we want that shift in their feelings. Same way I always tell teachers in normal school. I'm like, if you guys are gonna go do a writing assignment, just go grab some clipboards and do it out, in the field. Like
Yeah.
do that instead of just sitting in your classroom.
Yeah, and it's just such a good point that you bring up too about the mindset of parents because that's really where it all starts. And the mindset of certain parents now might be because of the couple sentences that their parents said 30, 40 years ago that had them think that rain equals bad or hot equals bad. And that stuck with them. And now they're full grown adults and that's kind of their automatic way to go to that. And now they're instilling it on their kids. So I think anybody listening that might have that, not to say you're wrong and not to say that that's not a way to look at something, but really just dive into that ideal that you have and think, can I change this? Is it really as bad as it seems? And there's certain situations like my wife, for example, has health conditions that she does not thrive in the cold as well. So I'm not saying that, everybody needs to switch it, but if you're just kind of saying it for the convenience or the comfort, then really dive deep into that thought and think like, wow, all right, maybe we could be mindful of the language that we're using because this might be affecting how my kid is as an adult and what they say to their kids. So just such a good point that you bring up, and I really think that that's going to be kind of the start to everything, and that's going to be the parents that eventually consider forest kindergartens and advocate for them and advocate for more recess or whatever it might be, and that's going to really promote the change. So really good point. I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, talking about language is usually the easiest place for parents to shift. They're like, if you need me to redo how I do everything, it's impossible. I'm like, all you need to do is like work on how you say or don't say a couple of different things. And that can make such a huge shift.
Yeah, yeah, night and day for sure. Awesome. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I feel like we could go for hours on it. We have in the past. We've had phone calls that we've, I think, gone
Yeah.
like multiple hours at a time talking
Yeah.
about this stuff, which I really could. And I think that I'd love to bring you on for another episode too, where we talk about other stuff. But before we do close out, I want to ask you one final question I like to ask all of my guests. So, you could offer just one piece of advice to listeners, whether that is a mindset tip or a practical parenting tip, what would it be and why? And separate from things that we might have already covered if possible.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and it's part of forest kindergarten and part of, even like an SI sort of thing. It's sort of in a trust the child led piece. So as a parent, my favorite thing whenever parents come to me about challenges that they're having and they like want all these answers from me, and sometimes I have really great answers and I love sharing them with the family. But I'm like, did you ask your kid? Have you asked them about it? And yes, not every kid can tell you with all their mouth words, but that doesn't mean they still can't give you an answer. And so if you're having a challenge, start with talking to them about it in some capacity first. And these are little people too, like starting to get their idea of what's going on and see what they're liking, what they want, and why these things are different. Because a lot of the times the answer is only going to be answered by your kid. So a challenge with your kid is often only answered by them. So what I always just tell families if they're coming with, a problem about something, my kid's not sleeping, he's not eating this, he's running around and this is happening, or he seems to always cry every time we go to grandma's, like whatever it is. I was like, have you talked to them about it yet? And just start there because they they are the ones that really have the answers. And we might have a lot of things that we can try as OTs and as other adults to see if we can discover the answer. And sometimes we have to do it that way because of all different circumstances, or you're dealing with someone who isn't speaking yet, like a 1 year old. But the easiest and the best way to approach it is that, oh, my kid has this answer and we just need to figure out like a way that they can tell me, that they feel safe letting me know, that they know that I will listen, that they're able to tell me, etc. In my practice, we have sort of a metaphor. People come to us because they feel lost in the woods and they don't realize that their child is holding the map. And so it's really, what can I do as an OT to help you and your child realize that they're the ones that lead their journey and that we are here to go with them and make sure they're safe and happy and, follow through with, supporting them where we can and offering them suggestions to, guide them in their life. That's our job as parents. But it's not our journey. We've had our journey and we're having our journey, and part of it is walking alongside of them in their journey. And so for them to be able to like access that map and however it is, whether it's making the relationship feel safe, whether it's the kid to realize they have a map, where it's the kid's been telling that they know the direction all the time and the parents unable to listen, et cetera, et cetera. There's like so many reasons, but just basically knowing your kid has the map to their own future and they're the ones that can help you get out of this, the woods and in their, next phase. And so I think that's really important for families to realize. And it like sort of takes away a little bit of the pressure of that I'm in charge of everything that has to happen here and otherwise they're ruined. But that also it gives you this awesome like feeling of, pride and you're there to support their journey and that they know where they're going. You just have to help them out. So that's my
That
biggest advice.
was that was beautiful. Honestly, like more than just like a therapy side, just like a life side. That was amazing. The walking alongside versus you said like solidifying that stance, I think is just perfect. No other words but perfect.
I'm glad.
So wise,
This is a
so
wonderful
wise.
thing.
Yeah. Do you want to also share your website,
Oh
your
yeah.
Instagram,
I
whatever?
know. Weirdly, I never even said the name of my own business. I like plugged all these other businesses. I didn't even say mine. Mine's called Little Fern Forest. We're just littlefernforest.com. I have an Instagram, Little Fern Forest. And Emily Bryce. You can find me easily on Facebook and stuff. My personal page, I share a bunch more stuff. I'm way better at doing stuff in one page than everywhere else. So, and perfect timing because my little person needs me. So this is really well timed.
There
And
we go.
thank you so much, Tyler.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it. This is an awesome conversation. I hope you have a great rest of
Yeah.
your day.
Thanks.
All right. See ya. Thank you guys so much for listening today. I hope you were able to see the value that nature has on everyone, especially your children. And if you'd like some more detailed information regarding how to get outdoors with your children, I'll soon be publishing my first book that provides parents more of an in depth look into why nature is important for your children, along with almost 50 activities that you can perform with your kids in different outdoor settings. It'll be available for purchase on Amazon, and I'll be putting the pre order link and announcing the launch date of the book on my social media pages soon. So please be sure to keep an eye out for that and listen to next week's episode for more information on the book. And if you enjoyed this episode today, please subscribe, leave a review, share the show with a friend. Inside the Tide is now streaming on all podcast platforms, YouTube, and links to social media pages can be found in the show notes below. And that's about it. I appreciate you guys for listening, and I'll see you next week.